The scream that tore through the servants' hall was not one of pain. It was disbelief. Thick locks of dark brown hair drifted down onto the marble floor as the woman kneeling there watched pieces of her own life fall away from her. Behind her stood Vanessa Sterling, a pair of silver shears still open in her hand. Her expression calm the way only cruelty dressed up as elegance can be calm. "Maybe now," she said, loud enough for every person in that hall to hear her clearly, "you will finally remember your place." Nobody in that room moved. Housekeepers stared at their own shoes. Bodyguards who had faced armed men without blinking suddenly found the floor tiles fascinating. Even the head butler, a man who had run this household for over 20 years, stood frozen as though his feet had been nailed down. Everyone understood the same simple truth. Crossing the fiancée of a mafia boss could end more than a job. It could end a life. But the woman on her knees did not cry. Ivy Bennett gathered the fallen strands of her own hair with steady hands, the same hands that had spent 4 years quietly holding this entire household together. She had once worn her hair down to her waist, hair her late grandmother used to call a woman's quiet crown. Now half of it lay scattered across cold stone. For a long moment, the only sound in that grand hall was breathing, shallow and afraid. Then something happened that nobody in that room ever forgot. Ivy reached up and gently took the shears from Vanessa's hand. Not with anger, not with tears. She simply took them, and without a single word of protest, she finished the job herself, cutting the remaining uneven length until it rested clean and short beneath her chin. She looked directly into Vanessa's eyes and spoke only one sentence. "You have just made a mistake you will never understand." Then she placed the shears down, smoothed the front of her apron, and walked back to work as though nothing at all had happened. Nobody in that mansion realized it yet, but the empire that Dante Morelli had spent his entire life building was about to crack open, not because of rival families, not because of betrayal, not because of violence. It was going to crack because the one woman everyone had overlooked had finally stopped giving more than anyone had ever asked her to give. Long before the sun rose over the eastern coastline, a single light always burned inside the Morelli estate kitchen. Every morning at 4:30, without fail, Ivy Bennett let herself in through the side entrance carrying an old canvas bag that had once belonged to her grandmother. She would greet the tired night guard by name, ask about his daughter's fever, and quietly leave a fresh cup of coffee at his side before disappearing further into the house. Nobody had ever asked her to do that. She simply remembered things. Remembering was her quiet gift. She remembered birthdays that people themselves had forgotten. She knew which gardener's joints ached before a storm. She knew the youngest kitchen boy secretly could not stand the taste of mushrooms, but was too shy to say so. She knew which security officers needed their coffee black after a long overnight shift, and which chefs grew nervous before hosting important dinners. To most outsiders, she was simply another maid, easily replaced, easily forgotten. But to the people who had worked in that house for years, she was something far harder to put into words. She was the invisible thread that held 100 small moments together every single day. The Morelli estate spread across acres of perfectly kept gardens overlooking the Atlantic coast, more resort than home, employing nearly 80 people across housekeeping, security, landscaping, transportation, and hospitality. From the outside, everything looked effortless. Chandeliers glittered. Flowers bloomed in flawless rows. Cars gleamed in the driveway. Guests always left impressed. What none of them ever saw were the small disasters quietly stopped before breakfast. That work belonged to Ivy. When an exhausted driver overslept after 3 straight night shifts, Ivy arranged a replacement before anyone noticed a delay. When a shipment of imported flowers arrived crushed, she rebuilt the arrangements herself using blooms from the estate greenhouse. When a frightened young maid shattered an antique dish worth thousands, Ivy quietly worked extra hours to help cover the cost before it ever reached management. No paperwork, no credit, just solutions. The older staff members often traded knowing looks whenever a guest praised how smoothly the household ran. They knew where that smoothness really came from. It was not expensive systems or strict rules. It was one woman who noticed problems before they became someone else's burden. Each morning around 7, the staff gathered briefly before their shifts began. The elderly head housekeeper, A woman named Evelyn Carter often watched Ivy moving quietly between departments while balancing an armful of fresh linens. One of the newer maids once whispered, "How does she always know where everyone is?" Evelyn smiled and answered simply, "Because she pays attention while everyone else is busy trying to look important." The younger woman frowned. "But she is only housekeeping staff." Evelyn's expression softened. "No, dear. Housekeeping is her job. Caring for this place, that is who she is." Very few people understood where that devotion came from. Years earlier, after Iva's parents died in an accident on the highway, her grandmother had raised her alone in a small town along the coast. They never had much money, but they never lacked warmth either. Every evening her grandmother would brush her long hair and repeat the same gentle words. "Hair grows because hope grows. Take care of both, and no one can ever truly take away your dignity." When illness eventually took her grandmother, Ivy kept her hair long, not out of vanity, but because every strand reminded her of the only real home she had ever known. She carried those memories quietly through every hard day that followed. She rarely spoke about herself. Instead, she listened. That was why frightened new employees often found themselves opening up to her after only a few short conversations. She never judged anyone, never repeated a secret, never made someone feel small. Even Dante Morelli had noticed her, though only in passing glances. The most feared man on the East Coast spent most of his life negotiating shipping contracts worth millions, settling disputes between powerful families, and protecting an empire built over decades. Weeks would pass without him spending more than a single night at his own home. Whenever he did return, everything simply worked. Dinner arrived on time. Meetings ran smoothly. Guests left satisfied. He assumed that was just how the household operated. He had no idea one person was quietly making sure of it. Occasionally, crossing the entrance hall before another business trip, he would nod toward her. "Thank you. Everything looks the way it should." She would smile politely. "My pleasure, sir." The exchange never lasted more than a few seconds. But someone else noticed every single one of those moments. Vanessa Sterling understood wealth. She understood appearances. She understood power, having been raised inside one of the most politically connected families in the state. What she could not understand was why the most feared man on the coast occasionally thanked a housemaid with something that looked almost like genuine respect. At first she brushed it off. Then she began watching more closely. Every small compliment, every quiet nod, every moment Dante acknowledged Iva's work without seeming to even realize he was doing it. A small seed of jealousy took root inside her, and it grew slowly, quietly, patiently, until the week Dante left for a lengthy negotiation with rival families in Chicago. By then, Vanessa had convinced herself of something that was never true. She believed Ivy Bennett was not simply staff. She believed she was competition. As she watched his convoy vanish beyond the estate gates, she allowed herself a private smile. For the next 7 days, she would be the one in charge. The very next morning, the mood inside the estate shifted almost instantly. For years, the household had run on an unspoken rhythm built from cooperation, where every department trusted the others and small problems were solved quietly before they ever became a headache for management. It was not fear that kept things running so well. It was mutual respect. Vanessa intended to trade that respect for obedience. She called every department head into the main drawing room, standing beneath the grand chandelier in an ivory suit, radiating the kind of confidence that assumes authority can simply be inherited rather than earned. "While Dante is away," she announced, "every decision passes through me. I expect perfect discipline and complete loyalty." Nobody argued. Evelyn lowered her eyes. The head gardener sighed quietly to himself. Even the head of security simply nodded. They all understood one thing clearly. 7 days could feel very long indeed. Within hours, changes began. Long-serving staff were shifted into less desirable duties. A new assistant, brought in from Vanessa's own family estate, began criticizing procedures that had worked perfectly for years. Employees were told to seek approval for even the smallest choices. The mansion grew quieter, though not in a peaceful way. People had simply stopped speaking freely. Only Ivy carried on exactly as before, greeting people with the same warm smile, preparing breakfast trays, teaching a nervous new maid the correct way to set silverware, gently reminding the pastry chef that one visiting guest could not eat almonds. She never questioned Vanessa's new rules. She simply kept helping wherever she was needed, because to Ivy, kindness had never depended on who happened to be giving the orders that week. 3 days later, the estate prepared to host an important dinner for visiting investors and political guests, an event Vanessa saw as her chance to prove she already had what it took to run the Morelli household on her own. Every flower was checked, every glass measured, every chair placed with careful precision. The dining hall looked flawless until Ivy noticed one small error. 2 seating cards for a pair of businessmen had been switched by mistake. Most people would never have caught it. Ivy remembered a banquet nearly 2 years earlier where those same 2 men had refused to sit near each other after a bitter legal dispute. Left uncorrected, it could embarrass the entire family in front of important guests. She approached Vanessa quietly. "Miss Sterling, I believe 2 of the place cards may have been switched by accident." Vanessa barely glanced at her. "They are fine. I only thought. I did not ask what you thought." Ivy paused. "I am sorry. I only wanted to prevent an awkward moment." Before Vanessa could respond, one of the estate managers walked past, spotted the mistake himself, and swapped the cards immediately. "Good catch," he said, smiling toward Ivy. The correction took only a few seconds, but for Vanessa it felt endless. She noticed several staff members glancing at Ivy with quiet admiration, and in her mind, the maid had just corrected her in front of everyone. The dinner itself went perfectly. Guests never knew how close the evening had come to disaster. Vanessa smiled through it all, laughed at the right moments, accepted every compliment gracefully. But underneath that polished surface, humiliation was slowly curdling into resentment. Once the last guests had gone and the staff began clearing the ballroom, Vanessa called everyone back into the grand hall. Her voice carried sharply through the marble corridors. "There is something that needs to be addressed." Nearly every employee gathered, confused about why they had been summoned so late. Vanessa walked slowly toward Ivy. "You seem to enjoy correcting people." Ivy looked genuinely confused. "I was only trying to help." "Help?" Vanessa repeated coldly. "Or were you trying to impress Dante?" A wave of discomfort moved through the room. "I would never," Ivy said. "Do not lie to me." Vanessa stepped closer. "I have seen the way he thanks you. I have watched you play modest. You think because you are useful, you matter." The accusation stunned the room into silence. Ivy lowered her eyes. "Miss Sterling, I have only ever wanted to do my work well." "Your work," Vanessa repeated, letting her gaze settle on Ivy's long hair. "It seems you have taken very good care of your appearance." Without warning, she reached for a pair of heavy tailoring shears left behind on a nearby cart. Evelyn gasped and stepped forward instinctively, but one sharp look from Vanessa froze her in place. "You forget who you are speaking to." Silence swallowed the room. Vanessa grabbed a handful of Ivy's hair. For the first time, real fear crossed Ivy's face, not from pain, but because in that instant she remembered her grandmother. Every gentle evening spent brushing her hair, every promise that dignity could survive even the hardest circumstances. The blades closed. A sharp metallic sound echoed off the marble. Then again. Long strands slipped from Vanessa's hand and drifted down onto Ivy's apron. Nobody moved. Several maids pressed their hands over their mouths to keep from crying out. A young gardener clenched his fists until his knuckles went white. The head of security stared straight ahead, aware that stepping in against the boss fiancé could cost every one of them their livelihood. Vanessa finally let go of the remaining uneven strands. "There," she said, smiling faintly. "Now perhaps you will remember your place." For several long seconds the entire mansion seemed to hold its breath. Ivy slowly knelt down and gathered every fallen lock with careful hands, almost as if she were collecting pieces of her own past. Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. She stood, reached toward Vanessa, and said only 3 words. "The shears, please." Still stunned, Vanessa handed them back. Without shaking, without a raised voice, Ivy finished cutting the rest of her hair herself, short, even, practical. When the last strand fell, she set the shears down carefully and looked straight at Vanessa, her expression holding no anger, only quiet disappointment. "You have just made a mistake you will never understand." She bowed slightly. "Excuse me." Then she picked up her card and walked calmly away, leaving more than 70 employees standing frozen in silence behind her, none of them yet understanding just how much that single act of cruelty was about to cost. The next morning, Ivy arrived at exactly 4:30, just as she had every single day for 4 years. The only difference was her hair, short strands now framing her face where a thick braid once fell down her back. Every person she passed paused, then quietly looked away. Nobody spoke about what had happened. Nobody dared to. She greeted the guard with her usual gentle smile, signed in, collected her supplies, and carried on with her assigned tasks exactly as listed. Dusting linens, polishing the staircase, restocking towels. Everything on her job description was completed with the same care as always. Nothing more. At first, nobody noticed the difference. Evelyn nearly asked Ivy to help train a nervous new hire, as she usually would, but stopped herself halfway through the sentence, remembering that had never actually been part of Ivy's job. It had simply been a kindness she offered without ever being asked. By lunchtime, the first small cracks began to show. A new kitchen assistant accidentally served mushroom soup to a senior accountant with a serious allergy. Normally, Ivy would have spotted the menu while passing through and quietly suggested a substitute before it ever reached the table. This time she walked past, not out of spite, simply because she was carrying towels upstairs. The soup reached the table before anyone caught the mistake, and the chef spent 20 frantic minutes preparing a replacement, only realizing afterward how many times Ivy had quietly prevented exactly this kind of error before. That same afternoon, a driver arrived nearly 40 minutes late to collect an important guest from the airport, having copied the wrong departure time onto his schedule. Normally, Ivy compared transportation logs each morning while delivering coffee to the office and caught these conflicts almost automatically. Today, she never entered that office. It was never actually part of her role. The guest waited, and the delay embarrassed the entire household. By evening, the whole estate felt subtly wrong. Nothing disastrous had happened yet, but nothing felt effortless anymore either. The house no longer moved with its usual quiet rhythm. Every department was suddenly struggling on its own. The following day brought even more confusion. Fresh flowers meant for a charity event were delivered to the wrong room entirely. Rare orchids reserved for an important guest sat forgotten in the greenhouse until they wilted in the afternoon heat. The florist blamed the housekeeping staff. Housekeeping blamed the office. The office blamed the delivery company. Arguments that had never existed before suddenly became routine, and nobody recognized the missing thread tying it all together. Ivy had never technically managed any of those departments. She had simply spoken to people, reminded them, suggested small fixes, noticed things before they became problems. Now she did none of that. Late that afternoon, a young maid broke down in tears after shattering an expensive vase in the music room. Months earlier, Ivy would have quietly comforted her, helped clean up the pieces, and found a solution before management ever found out. Instead, she walked in, looked at the broken glass, and asked calmly, "Has your supervisor been told?" The girl nodded through her tears. Ivy offered a small, sympathetic smile, said she was sorry that it happened, then picked up her cart and continued down the hall. The young maid stared after her, not because Ivy had turned cold, but because for the very first time she had let someone else carry the weight of their own mistake. That evening, Evelyn found Ivy eating alone in the staff dining room. She sat across from her without a word for a long moment before finally speaking softly. "My dear, you have become very quiet." "I have always been quiet," Ivy answered, looking down at her untouched tea. "No," Evelyn said gently. "You have always been kind." The words hung in the air between them. "You do not have to carry this alone," Evelyn added, reaching across the table. A faint smile touched Ivy's lips. "I am not carrying anything. I am simply doing the work I was hired to do. Nothing more, nothing less." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears because she understood exactly what those words really meant. For years, the estate had quietly accepted gifts that were never part of any paycheck. Ivy's patience, her memory, her compassion, her willingness to fix problems that belonged to everyone but her. Now those gifts were gone, and nobody had appreciated them until they disappeared. 3 days after the incident, the head of security stormed into the operations office after 2 patrol teams had accidentally been assigned to the same section of the grounds while another entrance sat unguarded for nearly an hour. No threat had occurred, but the mistake was unheard of. Every document checked out on paper, until he remembered that Ivy usually carried updated shift notes between departments whenever schedules shifted at the last minute. Nobody had ever asked her to. She had simply noticed the paperwork moved too slowly on its own. Similar realizations spread across the estate. The gardeners remembered how she used to bring cold water during summer heat waves. The laundry staff recalled how she reorganized delivery schedules whenever someone called in sick. The night guards remembered how she prepared food before overnight storms because nearby restaurants closed early. None of it had ever been required. She had simply cared, and she still did. She simply no longer believed it was her place to step in uninvited. By the fifth day, even Vanessa began to notice. She walked through the mansion expecting the same flawless service as always and instead found anxious staff scrambling through unfinished tasks. Breakfast opened late. Linens went to the wrong rooms. An important package for Dante's office sat unopened because nobody realized it had even arrived. Vanessa called an emergency meeting, her voice sharp against the marble walls. "What is happening in this house?" Silence answered her. She demanded explanations, and the department heads turned on each other instead, chefs blaming housekeeping, housekeeping blaming scheduling, scheduling blaming transportation. Standing quietly near the back, Ivy listened without a word. Years earlier, she would have stepped forward with a calm suggestion, quietly linking each department until the problem solved itself. Now she stayed silent, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, having finally accepted that carrying everyone else's work had never truly been hers to carry. Vanessa's eyes swept the room and landed on her, expecting one more quiet rescue. Ivy simply closed her notebook after finishing her own notes and said nothing else. Vanessa dismissed the meeting in frustration. As staff filed out, an old gardener murmured quietly to Evelyn, "I thought cutting her hair would humiliate her." Evelyn watched Ivy disappear down the hall. "No," she answered softly. "They only took away what everyone could see. What they never noticed was everything else she had been quietly carrying all along." Meanwhile, far from the estate, Dante Morelli's convoy was already making its way home. None of the people waiting for him yet realized that within a single day, he would notice something nobody had been able to hide. Not the missing flowers, not the scheduling errors, not the late meals. He would notice the silence. And once Dante started asking questions, somebody was finally going to have to answer them. Late Friday afternoon, the iron gates of the estate opened as a line of black vehicles rolled slowly up the driveway. Staff near the entrance straightened instinctively. Dante Morelli had returned. To most people, his presence brought a mixture of respect and fear, the calm confidence of a man whose decisions shaped the lives of thousands. Rivals feared his intelligence more than his temper, because he rarely needed to raise his voice to be obeyed completely. As he stepped out of the lead car, he paused. Something felt off. Not wrong exactly, just heavy. This house had always greeted him with quiet order, even after exhausting trips. Today the silence felt strained. Employees greeted him politely, but avoided his eyes. The butler's smile looked forced. Two young maids exchanged nervous glances before quickly looking away. Even seasoned men who had negotiated with dangerous rivals without blinking looked uncomfortable. Dante noticed everything and said nothing, simply continuing inside. In the grand entrance, Vanessa greeted him warmly. "You must be exhausted," she said, wrapping her arms around him. "It was productive," he replied. She launched into a detailed account of the successful dinner she had hosted and the improvements she had personally overseen while he was away. He listened politely, though his attention kept drifting. A painting hung slightly crooked in the corridor. Fresh flowers had already begun to wilt in the entrance hall. A security report sat unopened on a side table. None of it mattered on its own, but together it formed a pattern he did not recognize. This house had never overlooked details before. Someone had simply stopped noticing them. As they walked toward his office, a familiar voice spoke softly behind him. "Welcome home, sir." He turned, and for a brief second failed to recognize her at all. Ivy stood holding a basket of folded linens, her posture the same, her gentle smile the same, but her long hair gone, replaced by short waves resting just beneath her jaw. "Ivy," he said, slowing to a stop. She inclined her head. "It is good to have you back, sir." He studied her a moment. You changed your hair. She touched it almost absently. Yes, I wanted something different. The answer came too smoothly. Over the years, Dante had built an unusual skill for reading people. One of the reasons his empire had survived so many betrayals. People lied with their words. The truth lived somewhere else, in their eyes, their breathing, their silence. And right now, Ivy was lying, not out of malice, but out of protection. He nodded once. It suits you. A faint smile crossed her face. Thank you. She excused herself and disappeared down the hallway. He watched her go, then turned to Vanessa. When did she cut her hair? Vanessa shrugged. A few days ago. Why? I suppose women get bored sometimes. The answer felt hollow, but he said nothing more. Not yet. That evening, reviewing reports in his study, his focus kept drifting toward the strange atmosphere in the house. Meetings started late because paperwork had gone missing. Dinner arrived 15 minutes behind schedule. A guest room lacked fresh towels. These were mistakes he had simply never seen before. Near midnight, he called the estate manager into his office. Has something changed while I was gone? The man hesitated. No, sir. Everything is under control. Dante closed the folder in front of him. I have spent 20 years negotiating with men who built entire empires on deception. I know when someone is not telling me everything. Silence stretched between them until the manager finally spoke carefully. The staff has been adjusting. To what? Another pause. The changes. What changes? The man lowered his eyes. I do not think it is my place to say. Dante dismissed him, and that answer bothered him far more than any explanation could have. The next morning he began asking quiet questions, not as a boss, simply as someone paying closer attention. The head chef admitted mistakes had become oddly frequent lately, and when Dante asked what had changed, the man only sighed and said it was not his story to tell. Later, walking through the gardens, the landscaping supervisor admitted deliveries had grown disorganized, and again gave nearly the same answer. I do not believe I should say. All afternoon, conversation after conversation followed the same pattern. Nobody lied outright. Nobody blamed Vanessa directly. But every single employee, without meaning to, pointed toward the same uncomfortable truth. Ever since Ivy Bennett had stopped helping beyond her assigned duties, everything had slowly started falling apart. That realization unsettled Dante more than he expected. He had never asked Ivy to coordinate anything, never promoted her, never given her any real authority. Yet somehow the entire household had quietly depended on her for years. How had he never noticed? That evening he found her folding towels outside the guest wing. Ivy. She turned. Sir, I have spoken to several people today. She stayed quiet. They all seem to be missing something. A small smile. I am sure everyone will settle into a new rhythm. Is that what you think? I believe people adapt. He studied her. Were you unhappy here? The question caught her off guard. No. Have I treated you unfairly? Never, she said, clearly confused by the question. Then why does it feel like I have failed you? For the first time, emotion flickered across her face. You have always treated me with respect, she said quietly. And yet, she paused. Sometimes respect is not enough if people only ever notice what you do and never what you quietly carry. She realized she had said more than she meant to. I am sorry. Please excuse me. She bowed and walked away before he could ask anything further, but those words stayed with him long after she disappeared down the hall. Unable to sleep that night, he wandered the grounds and found the elderly head gardener trimming roses in the moonlight, a man who had served the family for over 30 years. If anyone understood the true heart of this estate, it was him. You have known Ivy a long time, Dante said. Since her very first week, sir, the old man replied. Tell me honestly, what happened while I was away? For a long moment, only the wind answered. Finally, the gardener spoke. Sir, I have buried friends. I have watched this family survive wars between powerful men, but I have never seen this house so ashamed of itself. Dante's pulse slowed. Ashamed of what? The old man's eyes glistened. Miss Sterling cut off Ivy's hair. The world seemed to stop around him. She did what? In front of everyone. The old man nodded slowly. Your grandmother always said dignity should never be taken from a person in front of witnesses. Miss Ivy never cried. She finished cutting it herself and returned to work the very next morning as though nothing had happened at all. Dante stared into the darkness, his face perfectly still. only the tightening of his jaw revealing the storm underneath. "She did not punish any of us, sir," the gardener added softly. "She simply stopped giving us everything she used to give for free." A long silence passed before Dante finally spoke, his voice almost frighteningly calm. "Thank you." As he turned back toward the house, every guard nearby instinctively stepped aside. They had seen him angry before. They had seen him ruthless. They had almost never seen him silent, because everyone who truly knew Dante Morelli understood one simple truth. His quietest decisions were always his most dangerous ones. 2 days later, every employee received an unexpected invitation to an estate appreciation banquet, an event that had not been scheduled in advance, sparking quiet curiosity throughout the household. Vanessa assumed it was in her honor, standing before a mirror while assistants adjusted her emerald gown, imagining Dante was finally about to announce her as the future lady of the Morelli family. She never imagined the evening had been arranged for an entirely different reason. By sunset, the ballroom glittered beneath its chandeliers, long tables filled with food prepared by the estate's finest cooks. For one rare evening, rank disappeared entirely. Housekeepers sat beside gardeners. Drivers laughed with accountants. Security staff swapped stories with the kitchen crew. Vanessa noticed only one strange detail. Instead of sitting beside Dante at the head table, her seat had been placed one chair away, leaving the space beside him empty. She frowned but assumed it was simply part of a surprise. Once everyone had settled, Dante rose slowly, and the room fell silent immediately. He looked out across hundreds of familiar faces, many who had served his family for decades, some who had watched him grow from a quiet young man into one of the most powerful men on the coast. Tonight he spoke not as their employer, but as the head of a family. "For years," he began, "I believed this house ran smoothly because of discipline." He paused. "I was wrong." Confused glances passed through the crowd. "I recently learned that someone here has been carrying responsibilities that were never written into any contract." His gaze drifted across the room and settled on Ivy, seated quietly near the middle tables, clearly wishing the attention would land anywhere else. Then he asked one simple question. "Who here has ever been helped by Ivy Bennett?" Silence held the ballroom for a long breath. Then Evelyn slowly stood. "She helped me after my husband passed away, when I could not return to work. She quietly covered half my duties for nearly a month and never once asked for credit." Another chair scraped back. The head chef rose. "When my son was hospitalized, she prepared my morning inventory every day so I could stay with my family." A driver stood next. "She remembered my wedding anniversary. I would have forgotten it myself." A gardener rose. "She brought us water through every summer heatwave." A security officer stood. "She made sandwiches for every overnight storm shift." Then another stood, and another. Housekeepers, laundry staff, receptionists, electricians, maintenance workers, senior members of his own organization, even the estate physician slowly rising from his seat. Within moments, nearly the entire ballroom stood, dozens upon dozens of people, every face turned toward her with quiet gratitude. Only Vanessa remained seated, staring around in disbelief. How could a maid inspire this much loyalty? Dante let the silence settle before walking away from the head table entirely, stopping instead beside Ivy. She began to rise instinctively, but he gently motioned for her to stay seated. "They told me," he said, his voice carrying easily through the still room, "that you were only a maid." He paused. "They forgot to mention you have been holding this entire family together." Tears filled Ivy's eyes instantly. She lowered her head, overwhelmed by the kind of attention she had spent her whole life quietly avoiding. Dante turned to face the gathered staff. "I failed to notice the person protecting this home while I was busy protecting everything outside it. For that, I owe Ivy Bennett an apology." The most feared man on the coast inclined his head, not for show, but with complete sincerity. Gasps rippled across the room. Vanessa shot to her feet. "Dante, you cannot be serious. She works for you." He faced her calmly. "No, she is family." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "So you are choosing a maid over your own fiancée." "I am choosing character over cruelty," he answered. Her expression hardened. It was only hair. His eyes went cold. "No, it was her dignity. You humiliated a loyal employee in front of witnesses to satisfy your own jealousy." If you can do that to the person with the least power in this house, you could do it to anyone. The room went completely still. Dante reached into his jacket and slowly removed the engagement ring Vanessa had given him months earlier, setting it gently on the table between them. Our engagement ends tonight. Vanessa's face drained of color. You would end our family's alliance because of her. No, he said quietly. You ended it yourself. Security stepped forward respectfully, not because he ordered her removed, but because she no longer belonged at the head of this family. Without another word, she gathered her things and walked toward the ballroom doors. Nobody stopped her. Nobody defended her. For perhaps the first time in her life, money and influence could not buy her any respect. As the doors closed behind her, the silence held for one more breath. Then Evelyn began clapping, joined instantly by another, then another, until the entire ballroom erupted into applause, not for Dante, but for Ivy. She covered her face, finally letting the tears fall that she had refused to shed days earlier, tears not of humiliation, but of finally being truly seen. When the applause faded, Dante addressed the room once more. Starting today, we will form a staff leadership council, one that ensures no person's contribution is ever overlooked again. He turned to Ivy. I would like you to oversee household operations and staff welfare. The position is yours if you want it. She stared at him, stunned. I am just a maid. A gentle voice answered before he could. No, my dear, Evelyn said, smiling through her own tears. You were never just a maid. You were the reason this house ever felt like home. The entire ballroom nodded in agreement. Months passed, and the atmosphere in the estate slowly returned, stronger than before. Departments communicated openly. Every contribution was recognized. Nobody carried invisible weight alone anymore. New hires often smiled with surprise when the composed woman introducing herself during orientation simply said, I am Ivy. If you ever need anything, please ask. Many later learned that before every major family gathering, charity event, or diplomatic dinner, Dante asked for only one opinion before making his final decisions. And it was always hers, not because of any title, but because she understood people better than anyone else in that house ever had. One quiet afternoon, they walked together through the gardens as spring flowers bloomed beneath a warm sun. He stopped beside the old stone fountain. I have been wanting to say something to you. She smiled gently. I know. I am sorry. I should have seen the truth much sooner. She looked toward the roses swaying in the breeze. My grandmother used to tell me that kindness does not lose its value just because people fail to notice it. She met his eyes. You did not fall for me because of my hair. You finally saw me because I stopped hiding behind it. He reached toward her carefully, giving her every chance to step back. Instead, she placed her hand in his. I should have seen you long before that, he whispered. Together, they kept walking beneath the fading evening light, no longer a mafia boss and a maid, but two people who had discovered that love built on genuine respect could survive any humiliation, that quiet sacrifice always outlasts power built on fear, and that the strongest heart in any home is often the one that spent years asking for nothing in return. Behind them, the Morelli estate stood peaceful once more, not because one woman had carried everyone else's burdens in silence, but because her quiet strength had finally taught an entire family how to carry them together.